Seja bem-vindo e bem-vinda ao nosso canal. Este evento é organizado pelo Escritório da UNESCO no Brasil. Ele discutirá questões relevantes para todos e cobrirá uma das 5 áreas do mandato da UNESCO: educação, ciências naturais, ciências humanas e sociais, cultura, comunicação e informação. Contudo, esclarecemos que as indicações de nomes e a apresentação do material ao longo deste evento não implicam a manifestação de qualquer opinião por parte da UNESCO a respeito da condição jurídica de qualquer país, território.
Communications and information. Nevertheless, may we clarify that the indications of names and the materials to be presented in the course of this event do not at all imply the expression of any opinion by UNESCO regarding the legal status of any country, territory, city, region, or their authorities, nor does it express any delimitation of their borders or limits. Therefore, the ideas and opinions expressed in this event are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of UNESCO, nor do they entail the organization or bind the organization. Check our UNESCO channels for other events and actions undertaken by the organization.
Good afternoon to all here in Lisbon. Good morning in Brazil, and good evening to you, Farida, in Pakistan. It's a huge pleasure to have you with us today as a special rapporteur on the right to education in this series of conferences organized by UNESCO Portugal, by UNESCO Brazil, and with the collaboration of UNESCO in Paris. It's a very important theme for us, the right to education. We are very much willing to listen to your presentation. And also let me say that it's also a pleasure for us here in Lisbon, in Portugal, because Portugal had an important role in the creation of the Special Rapporteur on the right to education in '98. And so it's for us, for all of us, very, very important to listen to you now. It's a huge pleasure to listen to your words about the right to education and human rights. We need it more than ever in the world. We need it more than ever in Europe, in Brazil, and in other regions of the world. Thank you very much for being with us, for your generosity, for your time, for your willingness to be with us. The floor is yours, Farida. Thank you.
Mute. Sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you so much. And good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. I'm honored and very grateful for this opportunity to talk about the human right to education and share some thoughts with you. And I'm just sorry that I'm not there in person with you. Let me start by saying that last year was a good time to reflect on the state of human rights. 2023 was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 30th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action, and the 25th anniversary of my mandate, the right to education. It was also the halfway point for Agenda 2030 and SDGs that strive for human rights-based development. Sadly, last year, again, the UN Secretary General said the SDGs are in deep trouble. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights noted these are challenging times for human rights. And since 2019, many countries have faced social and economic crises. Extreme poverty has become more severe. COVID-19 then exacerbated inequalities within and across nations, triggered economic crises, leading to the loss of so many lives, incomes, and livelihoods. It affected more than 1.5 billion students. And as always, the most vulnerable were the most hard hit. The net result has been a declining enjoyment of human rights, including the human right to education, which at its core is a right to learn, learning to know, to do, to live together, and to be. It's a right to lifelong learning and to free quality education, regardless of circumstances, location, or identity. And it encompasses all that is needed for this learning to take place. In the 25 years since the Right to Education mandate was created, thanks to Portugal, as you've just heard, successive mandate holders have substantially helped to evolve our understanding of this right and the obligations that it entails. So too has UNESCO, which as the lead UN agency on education, in some ways is really the guardian of the right to education. And it does play a crucial role in the wider complex ecosystem of national to global actors. There's been a shift in perspective from an equal right to education now to the right to equitable and inclusive education, meaning that learners should receive the support they require to succeed in a learner-centric supportive environment. This is not at all a simple task and needs very strong commitments. Inclusion is not integration, much less assimilation. The onus must not be on students to adapt. Instead, we need to modify educational content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies to overcome barriers so that all students have an equitable learning experience. And as an aside, I have to say, I'm not happy with the term learning poverty, which somehow suggests that the problem lies with the learner's inability rather than the systems that we have. Of course, much has been achieved. More children than ever before attend school, including higher education. Gender gaps are closing. There's a widening consensus that the right to education is an empowering right that opens pathways to so many other rights and is crucial for the development of individuals and communities and societies. Consensus is also growing on the importance of education as crucial platforms, not just for learning, but for the overall well-being and development of children, their families, and communities. There's an increasing understanding that the right to education is not confined to schooling, but encompasses informal and non-formal places of learning too. There is growing agreement on the need to ensure early childhood care and education. Norms are evolving relating to protecting the right to education in diverse emergencies, including conflicts and climate change, for which, however, protection frameworks need to be enhanced. But so much more needs to be done. Discrimination, exclusion, segregation, and assimilation policies persist, and in some places may even be growing. This violates the right to education, which means that everyone must have the same opportunities for quality, inclusive learning. Too many people continue to be excluded on the basis of gender and other identities such as class, religion, ethnicity, race, language, disabilities, location. And of concern too are educational systems that emphasize values of individual success, national competition, and economic development to the detriment of solidarity, the understanding of interdependencies and caring for each other and the planet, as noted in the landmark 2021 report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education led by UNESCO, Reimagining Our Futures Together. Education is a nursery for ideas, learning, and creativity, a space that must encourage critical thinking and questioning established ideas, promote independent views and expression, and set norms for how to engage with others, especially those who disagree with us. In our complex, multicultural, constantly and now rapidly changing world, we need to rethink how education is conceived of, structured, and governed, how and what we teach, including values, and how we assess such learning. The UN Secretary General's idea of renewing the social contract between governments and their peoples and within societies is therefore appealing. A new social contract grounded in human rights to rebuild trust that would allow the world's people to re-embrace, or in some cases, simply embrace global solidarity and find new ways to work together for a common good. The Futures of Education report recommends this new social contract is firmly grounded in two principles: an expanded vision of the right to education throughout life and a commitment to education as a public societal endeavor and a common good. And this, of course, is required at the local, national, and international levels. This also resonates and aligns well with the vision of the right to education mandate. And while there's a tendency to always focus on new challenges, let's remember that many persistent challenges inherited from the past are alive and kicking, such as exclusion, assimilation, segregation, discrimination, poor quality, ill treatment, and the lack of safety, just to name some. All of these impede the right to education for far too many. Many terrible violations of international law deprive children of their future and attaining their full potential. They also deprive us, the world's people, of such creativity and contributions. The gender apartheid persecution and the de jure denial of the fundamental right to education for girls and women in Afghanistan, for instance, is absolutely deplorable and really a crime against humanity. We must make good on the promise following COVID to build back better and rethink educational models and approaches with one foot in the past and one in the future, as someone involved in the Futures report so brilliantly put it. The foot planted in the past is essential to address persistent historical discriminations. The foot in the future is vital to consider how best to address new realities and emerging challenges, such as increased societal polarization, democratic backsliding, climate change, and the digital revolution. The right to education is the right to participate in all facets of educational life. Students, including children, educators, organizers, and other associated actors, develop active interpersonal relations through education. People use, rely on, and share their cultural resources as vectors of identity, values, and meaning. A participatory approach is thus pivotal to ensure that education is inclusive, does not perpetuate discrimination, or become a tool for assimilation. It will also help to put into practice education as a common good. The first mandate holder set out crucial 4 A's framework for the right to education, making education available, accessible, affordable, and adaptable. This framework has been widely adopted, including for other human rights. I am now proposing a 5th A, accountability. It's time to abandon the idea that the aims of education should solely be defined by ministries of education or cabinet members. People's participation is crucial to address current and future challenges. People in all their diversity must have a voice in planning, monitoring, and evaluating the educational systems, including children. Making education available means having a sufficient number of facilities that themselves are sufficiently equipped, including with water and toilets, for example, and appropriately skilled staff enjoying good conditions of work. Availability also means quality teaching. Accessibility means that all learners must be able to physically access facilities that are suitable and safe for everyone, and that teaching and reading materials are in languages and formats that are appropriate for all. Affordability is not just about fees. It relates to their other costs, such as transport and textbooks and learning materials. And in today's world, digital connectivity and devices. Adaptability means ensuring relevant languages and modalities for persons living with different disabilities, for example. It also means that the form and substance, including curricula and teaching methodologies, must be culturally appropriate, of good quality, and relevant to people's needs and circumstances. Since assuming the mandate, a few issues have stood out to me as critical that need urgent attention, as they all undermine the right to education. First is a question of finances and the purpose of education. Education is a common public good and it is the responsibility of states to provide education as a free public good. States must also ensure efficient, effective, and equitable management and financing so that regardless of identity, location, or background, everyone can enjoy inclusive quality education. This requires that states revisit existing national financial policies and priorities to ensure adequate funds are made available. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Child's Rights Convention both specify that states have an obligation to ensure the right to compulsory free primary education and the progressive implementation of free secondary and higher education to the maximum of available resources. SDG Target 4.12 commits states to ensure that all children complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education by 2030. Yet this progressive element is far from being implemented, and costs are always identified as the main reason. The lack of progressive implementation for secondary and higher education more than half a century after the Covenant is troubling and has repeatedly been pointed out by mandate holders and treaty bodies, because the increasing costs for such education effectively blocks access to further learning for those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, perpetuating and widening inequalities. When education is compulsory, it must be free. And in many countries, education is compulsory up to the age of 16 or even 18, which means secondary and even higher education. The notion of progressive implementation, which has enabled de facto non-implementation, must be dropped, especially since efforts to mobilize domestic financial resources still fall well below achievable objectives. Even when resources are very limited, states must allocate a sufficient proportion of the national budget for education and ensure that the money is used effectively and equitably to guarantee education for all, prioritizing the most marginalized. To achieve this, the 2011 Jomten statement recommends that educational budgets should be at least 6% of GDP or 20% of national budgets. Let's be clear, insufficient funding impoverishes the quality of education, and poor quality public education gives space to for-profit educational institutions that further exclude the marginalized. When funds are not available, highly restricted, or are reduced, this obliges public sector educational institutions to seek funds elsewhere, opening the door for a growing influence of corporate actors who would have specific agendas. Private funding in higher education, especially for scientific and academic research, usually comes with conditions that promote vested interests and a focus on specific issues or look for specific particular outcomes. Commercial actors, investors, and donors also step in when public funding is reduced due to debt, austerity measures, or unilateral coercive measures, which are commonly referred to as sanctions. The increasing role of commercial entities in the realm of education is worrying, as these are driven by profit-making that is
Somos
unaligned.
determinados.
Sorry? Sorry?
Sim, yes.
Something?
I think it's okay, Farida. We are listening to you. Please,
All right.
please. Thank you.
The increasing role of commercial entities in the realm of education is worrying because they're driven by profit-making. This is unaligned and often at odds with the human rights imperative of reaching the most marginalized first and not leaving anyone behind. Civil society organizations and experts are perturbed by the growing and disproportionate voice of the private sector in matters of education. The critical issue of the commercialization of education has been highlighted previously by the mandate. The private sector, of course, can and does play an important role. However, the primary responsibility still rests with states, who must not use the presence of private education to withdraw from this responsibility. And if parents have the right to choose institutions of study for their children, a precondition of choice is that there are public sector education institutions. And states should also ensure that the private sector schools adhere to human rights standards, of course. Additionally, commercialization may be contributing to a commodification of education and a narrowing down of its purpose. What I mean by this is that instead of nurturing human creativity by providing opportunities in a learning environment, to think critically and differently in all directions of the human mind, to question, to explore, and to fulfill one's lifelong learning potential, education is increasingly geared to ensuring people have marketable skills. This leads to reduced funding for, or sometimes entirely dispensing with certain subjects not considered market-worthy, which inhibits human creativity, curtails the right to education, and reduces education to a tool that is serving the market rather than individual and human well-being. My second area of concern is violence. And shockingly, an estimated 246 million children experience violence in and around schools, according to the Global Partnership and Fund to End Violence Against Children. This is both disturbing and absolutely unacceptable. It is also, unfortunately, probably a serious underestimation given the taboos that surround the reporting of violence in so many contexts. In my own country, Pakistan, for example, I know for a fact girls stay silent about sexual harassment for fear that they will be pulled out of school or be accused of having provoked the harasser and then face additional violence at home. In too many places, corporal punishment remains the norm and can sometimes and tragically lead to death, as sadly also seen in my country. Violence is multi-directional and it is also multi-dimensional. So teachers as well as students have committed suicide or been hospitalized. And measures are needed to prevent threats to, as well as by, learners and teachers and other school staff. In some contexts also, students and teachers confront violence on their way to and from school, including from criminal elements, and this too needs attention. So all states must strictly prohibit corporal punishment, put into place robust monitoring, provide safe reporting mechanisms, and effective redress for all forms of violence in schools. And a relative new critical problem is online violence, where it's often impossible to know who is the harasser. Bullying has always existed in schools, unfortunately, but earlier, those who were bullied could at least escape the toxic environment and when they left school. Now, cyber harassment follows them home and is constant. So, so many people, especially youngsters, the first thing they do when they wake up is to look at their phones and they stay connected right up to when they fall asleep. And cyber harassment also too often transmutes into physical harassment. Even in good educational systems, gender-based violence persists, as does other identity-based violence. To prevent violence, we must then ensure that human rights are folded into educational curricula, teacher education, and the training of all staff so that no violence takes place in classrooms or playgrounds. It's also important to ensure that teaching in multicultural classrooms encompasses and reflects this diversity in materials, language, etc. A different type of violence, which is also perturbing, relates to armed conflict and its impact on education. Between 2015 and 2020, more than 13,000 attacks on education or military use of educational facilities were recorded around the world. There is a growing understanding of how important it is to safeguard education in all circumstances, and 119 countries have now endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, an intergovernmental commitment to protect education during armed conflict, which also provides guidelines. I've been encouraging all states to endorse the declaration and to commit to avoiding the use of educational facilities for any purpose in support of any military effort. Regrettably, however, endorsements have not prevented schools and educational institutions from being targeted. The damaging effect of such attacks on the right to education and the lives of learners are devastating. Over 5,000 attacks on education and cases of military use of schools and universities were documented in 2020 to 2021 by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack in 84 countries, from Afghanistan to Yemen, in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. More than 9,000 students and educators were abducted, arbitrarily arrested, injured, or killed in these events. and this has increased since 2018-19. And now extremely disturbing figures are emerging from Gaza, where more than 80% of schools have been damaged or destroyed, deliberately targeted and repeatedly bombed, including after they started being used as shelters. At the last count, almost 5,000 students, 239 teachers, 94 university professors had been killed. Almost 8,000 students and 756 teachers were injured. The disruption of education is always distressing, but even more so in times of conflict, because education is so critical in enabling societies to move forward. Education helps people recover from the trauma of conflict, and most critically, it provides hope that a better life is possible. My third concern, and the subject of my second thematic report, is teachers. And I find it sad and ironic that the right to education, and therefore, in a sense, our entire collective future, depends on their being educators, but teachers are undervalued and undercompensated. They sometimes live below the poverty line, even in high-income countries. A study of 100 countries found that on average, educators were earning less than the local average costs of goods and services. A 2022 UNESCO report revealed that 6 out of 10 countries pay primary teachers less than other professions, which require similar levels of qualification. And there's a gender dimension, for research shows that when women dominate a field, that field, the average pay goes down, and the educational field is predominantly female. The result of poor conditions of work is a global teacher shortage, which is estimated in 2016 to be almost 70 million. The UN Secretary General therefore called for tackling this urgently, including by making the teaching profession more attractive for younger generations. But a major survey found that 48% of respondents do not think that teaching is an attractive profession for young people. Shortages mean higher student-teacher ratios, overcrowding, today, we expect teachers to be digitally competent, able to respond to pandemics, conflicts, and emergencies, to pivot and cope with shifting circumstances. But teachers are often poorly trained, held back by outdated roles, methods, and tools of instruction. They do not receive the support they need to pivot, to cope, and yes, for themselves to grow. And they are excluded from decision-making that directly impacts them. The right to education depends on having a sufficient number of trained and motivated teachers at every level. Adequate resources are critical to ensure decent conditions of work for teachers, who constitute some 75 to 90% of educational budgets. And in this regard, the ILO recommendation on the status of teachers, inter alia, pinpoints the right to education, to adequate remuneration, training and professional development, decent working conditions, academic freedom and professional autonomy, access to information and knowledge, as well as the right to form trade unions and professional associations, and to participate in social and policy dialogues and educational reforms. In terms of non-state educational providers, the Abidjan Principles on the Human Rights Obligation of States recommend that states define and enforce minimum standards applicable to teachers of private institutions as well, in keeping with human rights standards. Clearly, at present, we are failing teachers, and with that, we are failing the right to education. Building resilient educational systems requires establishing good trust and relationships between governments, teachers, their associations, parents, and communities. My report therefore stresses that states must ensure direct, open, and meaningful participation of teachers in educational decision-making and reforms. It also stresses that teacher education is a critical, irreplaceable element for making education more adaptable, inclusive, and responsive to current challenges. It is vital, for instance, to enhance teachers' skills for using new technology and pedagogies, and for working efficiently in bi- or multilingual or cultural settings. Teachers are also important agents of change, and not just through their work, but who they are. And inclusive education therefore requires student diversity to be mirrored by teacher diversity in terms of gender, disability, language, origin, etc. My fourth area of concern is academic freedom, which lies at the heart of knowledge production, creativity, and scientific progress, which in turn is vital for countering global crises such as the climate change, loss of biodiversity, food scarcity, and global pandemics. But this is only possible if we ensure the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity, as enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. I have to say, I love this phrase. It inspires me every time. And of course, this is inextricably linked to the freedom to express and share the outcomes of such activities. Academia and research must be places and processes where individuals are able to explore and express a range of ideas without self-censorship, freely challenge each other's ideas and prevalent notions. The exchange of competing and sometimes diametrically opposed viewpoints is precisely what allows individuals, academia, science, and humanity itself to develop and grow. Yet today, even as calls increase for academic and scientific findings to inform public policy, the freedom of academics, students, and researchers to explore ideas and express these is restricted on and off campuses. The space for their participation and governance reduced. I'm alarmed at the curtailment of freedom of expression, which is evident in the communications I've been receiving from across the world. And so I've been surprised by the plethora of ways in which academic freedom is violated and the variety of reasons for such curtailment that include social and political agendas, but also commercial interests. Across the globe, academics, students, scientists, and researchers are being silenced, sidelined, and denied resources. Individuals and associations confront harassment, both physical and cyber attacks, retaliation, repression, and imprisonment. They sometimes pay the ultimate price of their lives because of the issues they research, the questions they raise, the ideas that they posit, the sharing of findings in a variety of academic and public arenas, but sometimes even in private settings. Academic freedom is also curbed in less conspicuous ways, such as stopping promotions and publications, the loss of job security. It is undermined by censorship around particular subjects such as history, particular theories, environmental impact, the banning of books or subjects, the curbing of what is taught or how it's taught, but also by new non-academic oversight mechanisms. The autonomy of universities and research institutions, essential for academic freedom and indispensable for independent knowledge production, is often reined in, despite being guaranteed either in the Constitution or national legislation of many countries. The situation is so alarming that my current report, which I will present in June to the Human Rights Council, is devoted to this topic. Then there is the digitalization and emergence of generative AI. Today, digital technology increasingly permeates every aspect of life, from social media as a primary source of information and means of communication to rapidly expanding AI, e-commerce, and e-governance. Digital technology is shaping how we work, study, communicate, and interact with each other, how we live our lives, and yes, even how we think. Generally, we happily and quite unthinkingly embrace technology and innovation. We need to pause, to unplug, and to think anew. I assumed my mandate in the wake of COVID-19 and was taken aback by the widespread view of digitalization as a panacea for educational failings. First of all, digital technology is just that, a technology. What is important is how it's used and governed. The digitalization of education should, of course, support schools, learners, and teachers, but it must never replace on-site learning with human educators. And digital technology must not be used to justify the unavailability of schools or campuses for all learners. It is crucial that the introduction of digital technologies in education be framed around the right of every person to public, free, quality education and the commitment of states in this regard both under international human rights law and SDG 5. Second, digital divides and ensuing inequalities are just as real as rapid digitalization is. Divides exist between and within countries, between urban and rural communities, between genders, older and younger people, persons with disabilities. Almost half the world's population remains offline. The majority are women and girls in developing countries, especially Asia and Pacific, that accounts for 2/3 of the world's population. Moreover, not all schools have the equipment necessary, teachers have dissimilar digital skills, and students are not equally able to afford the devices or costs of connectivity. This negatively impacts resource-poor countries, schools, and people, deepening inequalities. Still, digitalization is a reality that's not about to go anywhere and will only increase. So all efforts to close digital gaps are vital. But let's be clear, bridging digital divides by itself will not create more educational opportunities or improve learning outcomes. Digital technology will not miraculously overcome illiteracy. And UNESCO estimates at least 763 million adults worldwide still cannot read or write. 2/3 of them are women, and 250 million children are failing to acquire basic literacy skills. Digital literacy cannot succeed if people don't have basic literacy skills. It will not increase school enrollment for the 244 million children aged 6 to 18 not currently enrolled. It will not transform deeply ingrained gender biases that disallow girls from attending schools, or indeed any other biases. Also, studies show the quality of education does not always correlate with the amount of tech used in its delivery. And digitalization can cause more problems as well. For example, a privatization of educational resources. Multiple digital tools and platforms, from class chats to smart board software and online school journals, are all owned and run by private corporations whose main aim by default is making profit, not the human rights imperative to reach the most marginalized first. There's also data mining and privacy issues. Today, data is the most sought after resource. Digital technologies in education generate very large amounts of personal data about students and teachers, as well as their families and friends, which is not always collected or used in a transparent manner, does not belong to schools, is used to further generate profit, and often disrespects the right to privacy and the principle of meaningful consent, as has been so vividly documented throughout the COVID period. Another danger is digitally spread mis- and disinformation that can reinforce prejudices and biases. And then there's the critical issue of who populates the digital world. So many people of different languages, language speakers are excluded, and many other people who don't have access to the net in the first place. Finally, in the rush to go digital, insufficient attention is paid to the effects this may have on students' psychological well-being, of feelings of isolation, as well as their physical well-being and health and development. And this is something that the 2023 Global Education Monitoring Report on Technology has already sounded the bell on, the alarm bell on which we should listen to. Ultimately, if we want our younger generations to be prepared for the future, we should not thoughtlessly embrace everything that is new, shiny, and tech. Instead, we should strive to bring about a genuine partnership to govern digitalization. This requires meaningful participation of all actors, for teachers, organizations, parents, children in an age-appropriate manner, and civil society in collective decision-making, assessing the benefits and risks, and not consultations just as a formal tick mark. And then now we are facing the growing use, new risks and challenges of artificial intelligence, especially generative AI. It's important to question who owns the technology and data we help to generate through its usage, how our data is used, and who profits from it. There are issues of copyright and ownership of academic work. And there's, for example, academic work posted online has done so to increase visibility of our ideas. But are we instead simply feeding the ever-growing appetite of the AI machine? The use of generative AI by students also raises the question of how do we really assess whether learning has taken place? The growing reliance on tech-mediated decision-making is especially disturbing. Algorithms are based on what programmers define as the norm. They are inherently biased and exclude the marginalized and different, those whose realities disappear from the equation, leading to further exclusions. Contextual information, essential for understanding and supporting the vulnerable, is often not considered in tech-mediated decision-making. For instance, women's underrepresentation in the tech industry can lead to an unconscious gender bias in the design and development of new digital products and services, further perpetuating inequality. And the same principle applies to others who are unrepresented, which may be on the basis of race or ethnicity or other demographics. We need to ensure users, including policymakers and researchers, as well as learners and educators, are cognizant of the risks of data and algorithm biases. I see serious problems in relying on AI for standardizing tests or assessing progress, for instance. Single global frameworks of metrics for education performance data, such as PISA or the SDG indicators, often disregard cultural diversity, spiritual realities, and diverse worldviews of different populations. So let me end with a simple example I've been using to illustrate the issue with standardized testing, and I apologize to those who've heard it before. And this is, let's take a question. Let's suppose the question is, what is the maximum number of people who can ride a motorcycle? The standard answer, correct, is likely to be 2. However, in my context in Pakistan, the correct answer is at least 5. The dilemma for the student then is whether to answer according to the reality she knows and has observed, or whether to insert an answer that will earn her points by prioritizing someone else's reality. But seriously, how can anyone learn by ignoring their own reality or being punished for being true to it? And finally, as many tasks become automated and many professions disappear in the digital age, it becomes all the more important to promote interpersonal skills, critical thinking, and above all, creativity. This thinking beyond known fact is the competitive advantage that human beings have to imagine what has never been imagined before, to think outside the box. This is something that AI-driven mechanisms simply cannot do. Human creativity and ingenuity depend on people interacting with each other, the natural and built environment in all its diversity, resulting in a glorious plurality of thinking and perspectives that really is a hallmark of humanity itself. And given the increasing challenges brought on by AI, I will do my next report on AI in education. To conclude, these are some of the key issues related to the human right to education that I feel need urgent scrutiny, and the responses to which must be firmly anchored in international human rights law and standards. So finally, I must also acknowledge UNESCO's very active role in leading the discussions on the futures of the right to education. The Evolving Right to Education initiative has prompted important dialogues around which aspects of the right to education framework may need to be rethought and reframed in the light of 21st century trends, achievements, and challenges. Imagining our futures, reimagining our futures, I find both inspiring and thought-provoking. And I'm really pleased at the alignment of thinking in UNESCO on education and my mandate. And finally, I'd like to thank the UNESCO chair on the futures of education at the University of Lisbon, as well as UNESCO Brazil, for giving me this opportunity, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Thank you very much, Farida Shaheed, for this overview of the problems related with the right to education in your 5 points that you expanded in your lecture, finances and the purpose of education, questions of violence, questions related with teachers, questions related with academic freedom, and finally, your last point about digitalization and generative artificial intelligence. It was very, very important for us to have your words and to see your thinking and the work you are doing in this special rapporteur on the right to education. If you have still 5 or 10 minutes, I will ask you one or two questions. Some of them can come from the audience here at the University of Lisbon, but I will immediately begin with your third point, that is about teachers. And so the problem that we are living in the world that you are mentioning about the shortage of teachers, and also the problems related with the status and the condition of teachers. And I would like to hear a little more from you because that was one of the reports that you were presenting to the United Nations about how does it affect the right to education. I'm not talking only about the rights of the teachers, which of course are also important, but how this condition of shortage of teachers and a certain devaluing of the profession affect the right to education. And of course, I'm mainly thinking about Africa, where the shortage of teachers is dramatic and it can cause many problems, not only for the future of Africa, but indeed for the future of humanity. If you are kind enough to expand a little on this issue of teachers, will be very appreciative.
Thank you. Yes, I am concerned. It's not just a question of the rights of teachers. Rights of teachers is one part of it. But as I said, the impact on education itself has meant, for instance, when you have poor conditions of work for the teachers, or when there is an actual shortage, there is not enough. It undermines the quality of education. It undermines the ability of children to learn if they're going to be a lot of students with very little attention from the teacher. As I said, it leads to overcrowding of classrooms and teachers' responsibilities regarding so many students usually ends up in very poor quality. We've also seen that teachers are then taken on without maybe the minimum educational background that they need. They are also not provided with the kind of capacity building and professional development that they also require. And I think all of this impacts, we talk about inclusive quality education. It doesn't end up having any quality at all. So I don't think it's sufficient for us to be able to read and write. I think education means a development of your whole personality. And if you don't have the teachers, I don't know where you're going to get it. There's some refugees from Afghanistan in one of my meetings, for instance, was saying that he ended up relying on Google. I don't think Google for language teaching or anything. I don't think Google is who we want to be teachers. We need people who are professional in this. And I think that then has a knock-on effect of teachers then get disinterested. You have too much pressure on them. Students are not able to learn because of the overcrowding, the less attention that's paid to them. The quality deteriorates, and then the learning outcomes are also negatively impacted. So I think these are all things that relate to the right to education of everyone. So not just the right of teachers, but the right to education itself is impacted by this global crisis. And unfortunately, I do not see this, I don't see enough efforts to try and improve the conditions of teachers. And partly this also has to do with the financing that I mentioned. When you do not have enough financing, and when the educational budget takes up 75 to 90% is really teachers that you are paying for. When you cut them down, and when you have debt servicing, and when you have austerity measures put into place, this worsens the whole situation too. So it's not something that is very simple. It's not just that I'm sitting here with my teachers and the teachers are not coming. But I think there is a genuine problem in the status of teachers. My generation, teachers were considered something that you looked up to. It was a valued profession. Unfortunately, there are few countries now, much fewer countries, where this is a valued profession, and we need to make it valued. So we need to pay them accordingly and make sure that their conditions of work are sufficient for them to be motivated to continue in this profession.
Thank you. Thank you indeed, Farida. At the beginning of your talk, you just said, and it's very important to stress that point, that it's not only to have access to education, but also to have access to an inclusive and equitable education. And so we have a kind of a shift in the reports and in the orientation of the United Nations, stressing the idea of inclusion and equity. And this, of course, relates directly with your last point. And I know that you are that you are giving many attention to that about digitalization and artificial intelligence. Obviously, no one of us can deny the importance of technologies in our world. But we all know, as said in the GEM report by UNESCO that you are quoting, that mainly during the pandemic, that technologies help to solve many problems, but at the same time, probably they create more problems than the ones that they solve. And so there are fragmentation, there are divides in the world related with that. And so linking the two ideas, I believe that the point about the relationship, the pedagogical relationship between a teacher and a student, and the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, Stefania Giannini, was talking about the possibility that you were presenting also here in Portugal of considering this pedagogical relationship as a kind of common world heritage of humanity, of bringing this relationship as something that we need to preserve. Maybe I would like to understand a little better how you relate this with artificial intelligence and all the possibilities that are opened by the artificial intelligence, but also the many risks and the many problems and the many divides that we are creating through the use of this kind of technologies and digital divides.
So let me just say there are two or three things. Let me say that I would agree with the director, Stefania Giannini, that the relationship between teacher and student should really be considered something which is to be preserved, which is essential. And so maybe it is a world heritage or something, because the relationship between teachers and students may be quite different in different cultures. I think what's important is that relationship. It's a dynamic relationship. It's not a one-way street. In terms of the increasing digitalization generally, let me talk about that first. In the Child Rights Convention, the Child Rights Committee had a meeting regarding the rights of the child in the digital world. And what struck me there is also something that a psychologist from Italy said. He said that he's extremely concerned about children from 0 to 5. So maybe he's talking about 1-year-old, I don't know. But up to the age of 5, no longer being able to have the cognitive skills for social interaction, because everyone is so focused on these digital devices and it's used as a babysitter and it's whatever. But his fear was that we're losing that ability to socially interact with each other. And if we cannot interact with each other, I think there is very little purpose in education for all of us. That has to be one of the key things. When we say to learn, to live with each other, then yes, that has to be there. And I think that does not help when he wasn't even talking about generative AI. He was just talking about the pressure and the use of digital devices so much that there is, and students from that discussion, the youngsters who were there, they don't make any difference between their life online and offline. That's something only oldies like myself, a dinosaur I am, think of. It's not like it's something for them, it's their life. So whatever happens in that world is really crucial. But depending on biased algorithms to tell you what is real and not real, I think becomes a real problem, which is why I gave that little example. But it's an example to illustrate that children are being told that only what is real is what is in the digital world. So, I have colleagues, I've had to tell them, go down to the library. Everything is not on this digital world. So I think the digital world is biased. And people have asked, as I asked right now, who populates that digital world? And so many people of language who speak languages which are not in the digital world are left out. People who are poor are left out. People who are marginalized are left out. And that's before the algorithms ever come in. So I think there are issues that we need to think about, that how do you connect this? It is a reality. It's not going to go away. I just don't think we yet have the understanding, and we don't have a channel or a clear pathway forward. And, even people who have started the generative AI, I forget the person's name, but my son sent it to me, says we need to stop this right now until we know where it's headed. And I think that's something which a number of people who have been responsible for the generative AI are now wondering, is it going to get out of control generally, not just in education, that it'll take on a life of its own and we will continue to depend on it. And I think those are some of the dangers. I don't have the answers. I do think there's a need to think about these and to think about them responsibly and to have everyone at the same table. So I think the companies who own these programs should be at the table. Unfortunately, they very rarely, if ever, come to the human rights table. So I think we need a coming together of people from different backgrounds to talk about the kinds of issues that we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Farida Shaheed. It was indeed a pleasure to listen to you, to have you with us today. I know that it's very late in your country. It's, I believe, 9:00 p.m. So we are going to end this interaction and this session. Thank you again for your generosity, for the interview, for Diário de Notícias that was published today here in Portugal. All these materials will be available in our site and in the site of UNESCO Brazil, of course. And it was really, really very important for us to have this talk on the right to education. And I want also to thank you for all your work as Special Rapporteur of the United Nations. It's indeed very important for all of us to think, to talk, and to discuss these kind of issues. Thank you. Thank you very much, Farida.
Thank you so much, and for the opportunity, both to you in Portugal and Lisbon and to Brazil for this opportunity. And I look forward to continuing engagement and work with the UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Já não estamos online?